In this era of racial reckoning where the right to vote is still being suppressed, 100 years ago, women were fighting to be part of the democratic process, a struggle spanning 3 generations.
Women needed economic rights. They needed educational rights. They needed a lot, but they also needed the right to vote.
In 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. Women were excluded from higher education, not allowed to own property, and if married, forced to give up control of their finances. If the marriage failed, even lose custody of their children. Then, inspired by the abolitionist movement against slavery, many white, largely middle-class women also began to question their inequality. But their fight for the right to vote was being waged during some of the worst years of Jim Crow racism, with the rise of the Klan and obstacles against all blacks voting. And black women's leaders were marginalized. How were black women treated then?
Black women were still treated horrifically. Part of the narrative about black women was that they really weren't women. They were black in the most kinds of derogatory, inhumane ways.
Founding member of the NAACP, Ida B. Wells, was a fierce advocate for women, black and white, says her great-granddaughter.
She had this sense of hope and empowerment. And so I think that greatly shaped her worldview and what she thought she had the rights to, every right that was promised after emancipation.
So in 1913, when suffrage leaders held a parade in Washington, D.C., they tried to make Ida Wells walk apart from white suffrage leaders. She refused. Congress passed the constitutional amendment in 1919, but it was not final. There was still more drama. Ratification depended on getting 3/4 of the states to adopt it. By the summer of 1920, they still needed one more state when Tennessee was about to vote. Harry Byrne, a 24-year-old state legislator in Nashville, was opposed until the day before the final vote.
He gets a letter from his mother who says, "Harry, be a good boy and help to get Mrs. Katz ratification." And he did.
A victory decades in the making, but in the South, black women still could not vote. It was just the beginning of the nation's long battle for equal rights for blacks.
You know, one of the sayings from the movement, songs from the movement, is that freedom is a mighty hard struggle. It is a mighty long road. And that's where we are right now.
A battle carried on by black women leaders in the movement across the country and throughout the South for decades, continuing with the Voting Rights Act and continuing with voter suppression today.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.